Now I am very happy to introduce Kate Reynolds, our next speaker. She'll speak on Beyond Prevalence, Mapping the Spectrum of Psilocybin Use with NSIHT Data. Kate is the Director of Research at RMPDS and has been with Rocky Mountain for nearly 17 years. I've known her for that entire time. She's had the master's degree in public health from Drexel University and has been spending the last 3 years supporting the development of all these tools that we've talked about. So now we'll just take a moment and let Kate go through her talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Today I'm going to be speaking very briefly on an overview of our psilocybin data to demonstrate the depth of data that we can capture through the NSIHT tool. We've covered a lot of this already, but I will just provide a brief reminder. NSIHT is an online survey. We use a commercial survey panel company to recruit from an existing panel of online survey participants. We capture information on 17 different psychedelic substances and include the full spectrum of use from everything from infrequent to frequent use and perceptions from naysayers to enthusiasts. Our survey is representative of adults in the US. Our target population are those who used at least one psychedelic in the last year. We employ a number of survey design best practices, including randomization, adaptive questioning, and so forth, and a number of methods to mitigate bias, which includes careless response, content validation, and transport weighting, which you just heard about from Dr. Black. Our 2024 sample of psychedelic respondents came together through 2 launches, each over 2,000 psychedelic respondents, for a total sample of 4,329 psychedelic respondents out of 57,000 of total surveys completed. Very briefly, the survey sample itself is quite diverse. We have coverage of all 50 states and Washington, D.C. We have about 50% of people using one or more psychedelics, using 2 or more psychedelics, and all psychedelics are covered. About 29% are non-white race, and we have good coverage of particular subpopulations of interest, including veterans and first responders. Okay, let's start looking at the data. So this chart shows us the prevalence of use of different non-pharmaceutical substances and psychedelics. The top bar, orange bar there, is cannabis use, which is not surprisingly the highest prevalence of use at 19.7%. Followed by that is any psychedelic use at 4.8%. The highest prevalence of use of any specific psychedelic is psilocybin at 2.1%, followed by the others there at the bottom. And psilocybin use is more common than methamphetamine, heroin or fentanyl, and cocaine use. Okay, now let's look a little bit more at the reasons. We've already seen some versions of this, and the point of this series of slides is to emphasize that the reasons really vary by type of psychedelic. So for psilocybin, the top reason is for fun and enjoyment, which is something Rick Darts shared earlier today. And you can see that to treat a medical symptom is quite a bit lower. When we look at prescription ketamine, to treat a medical condition becomes most common, which is not all of that surprising. When we look at MDMA, we see the emergence of to enhance sex. And finally, with LSD, we see several common reasons, though for fun and enjoyment does remain the most common. Okay, let's dive deep into our psilocybin data. This graph, or this slide, shows us 2 different maps to demonstrate geographic prevalence of use. On the left, the blue, we have any psychedelic use. And the darker blue means that these are the states with the highest prevalence of use. In the blue, or any psychedelic use chart, we see a clustering in the west and a few states out east. But when we move to the psilocybin use, we start to see the emergence of Midwest states, including Nebraska and Illinois. Okay, let's look at our mental health profiles among those using psilocybin. So this chart shows us 3 different populations, those using psilocybin in the last year, those that used another psychedelic in the last year, and those that did not use a psychedelic in the last year. The blue circle is those diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and the orange circle is those diagnosed with a depressive disorder. You can see among the psilocybin users that the proportion with an anxiety disorder or depressive disorder are higher than the other 2 groups. And when we look at prevalence of current anxiety symptoms, we actually see the proportion is lower among psilocybin as compared to the proportion with a diagnosis of anxiety. And when we look at another psychedelic or no psychedelics, we see less difference there. And then finally, when we look at current anxiety symptoms, we see the proportion with current anxiety symptoms is actually a little bit higher among psilocybin users and quite a bit higher among other psychedelic users. And now we see among the no psychedelic users that the differences between diagnosis and active symptoms is not that noticeable. Okay, so what does this mean? Clearly, it's important to capture both diagnosis and current symptomatology. These things may be different. It's also important to consider, especially in the States, access based on symptoms rather than diagnosis. This is how Colorado and Oregon are operating, though it may be different in future states. It's important to think about public education around the appropriateness of each substance for each condition. And I think this data validates that the real-world patient populations are likely to differ from those studied in clinical trials. Okay, let's move on now to motivations for use and the subpopulations within the psilocybin users. So we have 3 bars here. On the left, we have those who are using psilocybin to treat medical symptoms. The middle is those that are using to treat medical symptoms and another reason, and the blue on the right is those not using to treat a medical symptom, only using for other reasons. I think what's striking about this slide is that the proportion that are only using to treat medical symptoms is very, very small. It's only 2.6%. It's much more likely to have treating medical symptoms plus another reason or not at all to treat medical symptoms. So when we look at the characteristics of these different groups, particularly around their other substance use, starting with psychedelics, we see that among those treating medical symptoms, they're much more likely to be using more than one psychedelic. And among those treating medical symptoms and other reasons or not treating medical symptoms, it's just about as equally common to be using psilocybin alone or more than one psychedelic. Okay, now let's look at co-use or concomitant use. And when I say co-use, I mean use at the same time. So when we look at the group using to treat medical symptoms alone, we see that there's a much smaller proportion using cannabis and alcohol at the same time, which is probably not all that surprising. And then the co-use among those treating medical symptoms and using for other reasons, along with not treating medical symptoms, have a much higher proportion of co-use with cannabis and alcohol. And this is important, again, when we think about these two more prominent groups. They're a much larger proportion of the population, and they're very likely to be co-using with other substances, and that may indicate a high-risk use among the psilocybin population. Okay, one last characterization. Let's take a look at these different subgroups and their reported mental health improvements. So not surprisingly, both groups that are treating medical symptoms along with treating medical symptoms and another reason are much more likely to agree or strongly agree that their mental health improved due to their psilocybin use. And we don't see that strong agreement among the group not treating medical symptoms. Okay, let's put all of this together. So we see that psychedelic use is common, and there are diverse motivations for use. Only 2.6 are solely using for medical reasons. Use is complex, and use not for medical reasons is much more common than use for medical reasons. And it's much more likely that any of these groups are using concomitant substances. There are high rates of depression and anxiety, but varying rates of current symptoms. And this might reveal the current treatment-seeking population. All of this complexity around symptoms, diagnosis, and population create challenges for monitoring, but do provide opportunities to refine data collection. And that's all I have. I do want to say a special thank you to Dr. Rockhill, who helped me prepare these slides.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. Now, I know we haven't had a ton of time for questions here because we've just had so much data and so much on methods, but you'll have a chance to ask questions during the panel.